Hi audience, hope you would be fine. In this short video we would be discussing the classical period of literary criticism. Actually it is asked that since when criticism started. Answer to this question is that literary criticism is as old as is the history of English literature. As we know that our initial ancestors of the Greeks have been having a great literary taste and literary developments. Our all literature, our all Western literature and philosophy are coming out of the Greeks. Therefore, the story of the Western literary criticism begins shortly after 1800 BC in the ancient Greece. The era of these great Homeric episodes in which Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as the poets Ensoid and the Sappho. Sappho was a female poet in the Greeks. The so-called classical period started around 500 BC, means around 500 BC and 800 BC started the great literary productions in Greece, and similarly in that period the evolution of criticism has been witnessed. So with the inception or with the production of the great tragedies of Euripides, Aeschylus and Sophocles, and the comedies of Aristophanes, it was around this time that the foundation of the Western philosophies were laid by the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And the disciplines, other disciplines like the rhetoric and the political system of the democracies were established in the Athens. We know all the modern philosophies which we are practicing, like democracy, all have been coming out of the Greeks in that time. The classical period is usually said to be end in the 323 BC with the death of Alexander the Great. After this, the Hellenistic period started. With this, the diffusion of Greek culture through the much of the Mediterranean, Middle East, and the diffusion vastly accelerated by Alexander the Great. His conquest means at this period the expansion of the to the world has magnified and increased at many great speed. With this, various dynasties established by all the journals after his death of the Alexander the Great. So Alexandria in Egypt, we see it was founded by Alexander in 331 BC, became a center of scholarship and letters, housing an enormous library and the museums and hosting such as renowned poets and the grammarians and such as Callimachus, Alophones, Rhodes, and Zodiotus. All these were the well-known literary critics of that time. We know that these figures partly through the work of Suetonius, who has been living during 69 to 100 BC AD, who wrote the first histories of English literature and criticism. So Suetonius is considered as the first critic of the Greek period, and he is also considered as the founder of the criticism as well. The Hellenistic period is usually said to be end with the Battle of the Actium in 331 BC, in which the last portion of Alexander's empire, means Egypt, was annexed by the increasingly powerful and expanding Roman Republic. After his victory at the Actium, the entire Roman world fell under the sole rulership of the Julius Caesar's nephew Octavian. Octavian soon became the revered as the first Roman emperor, means Augustus. Augustus, we call it as the Augustus period as well, means Augustus period in Greek was such a period which was considered of the supreme and the good literary taste as well. So during this span, almost 1,000 years, poets, philosophers, rhetoricians means are those who create the political rhetorics, grammarians, and the critics laid down many of the basic terms, concepts, and the questions that were to shape the future of the literary criticism, and it evolved all the way through their own century. And these include the concept of means in that period, mimesis means imitation, the concept of beauty and its conception with the truth, goodness, and the ideal of the organic unity of the literary works, social, political, moral function of literature. All these have been the major discussion of that time. The connection between the literature, philosophy, and the rat tricks, and the nature status of the language, and the impact of literary performance on the audience, all these have been the discussion of that day. And the impact of literary performance, the definition of the figure of speech such as metaphor, metonymy, symbols, and the notion of canon of the most important literary works, and the development of various genres such as epic, tragedy, comedy, lyric, poetry, and the songs. All these have been the production of that time. It means during the period of Alexander to Augustus. So in this period, means this period of 100 years was the greatest period of evolution of the literary criticism as well. The first recorded instances of criticism go back to the dramatic. Drama was the initial form of art which was practiced in Athens as well. A particularly striking literary critical discussions occur in Aristophanes' play The Frogs, the first performed in 1405 BC. This comedy stages a contest between two literary theories representing older and the younger generations. Means at the same time they were representing the older generation and the younger generation. It is also a contest between the poetic art. The two competing poets are presented as Aeschylus and Euripides. Aeschylus represents what, and Euripides represents what? So now we are discussing this. Aeschylus represents more the traditional virtue of a bygone generation. Even in today times, we say that the older generation was greater one, the older values were preferred one. So Aeschylus was of that older traditional values. He emphasized on that, and such as the material prowess, heroism, and the respect for the social hierarchy, all embodied in the lofty, decorous, and the sublime style of the speeches. Means where the poet is standing and making a long sublimious speeches, while Euripides is the voice of more recent democratic secular, means modern form, secular and plain speaking generations. Plain speaking, from here plain speaking means speaking in simple words. So later on, which we see in the theory of Wordsworth, Aristophanes' play reveals that for the ancient Greeks, poetry was an important element in the educational process. Its ramification and extended over the morality. And there was some Greek poetry. Aristotle is of this view that poetry is more preferable. It is more an educational process. It teaches morality, religion, and entire sphere of civil responsibility. While later on Plato, who was the teacher of Aristotle, he was against the poetry, and he prefers philosophy over poetry, as poetry was some sort of considered as the most ambiguous, chaotic, imaginable, and philosophy and the civic sense was more of the practical nature. Therefore, Plato prefers practical criticism and practical sort of activities in the society rather than the imaginative one. By the time of Plato and Aristotle, poetry had achieved considerable authority and the status. Means in our next video we would be discussing about the poetry and the concepts of Plato and Aristotle about poetry. But by this period, by the period of this 100 years, we come to know that poetry had got an authoritative status. Plato rejects poetry's vision of the world as unpredictable. Plato is of the view that poetry's world is unpredictable, ruled by chance, and always prone to the whims of the gods. Much of the Plato's philosophy is generated by a desire to view the gods as wholly good, to impose order on the chaos. He was of more of practical nature, to enclose the change and temporality within a scheme of permanence, and to ground our thinking about morality, politics, religion on the timeless and universal truths. So Greek philosophy begins as a challenge to the monopoly of the poetry, and extension means majorly our discussion was more about the poetry, and the extension of this vision is more recent in trends such as sophisticated and rhetoric, which offered a secular, humanistic, and realistic view of the world. Plato's opposition of philosophy to the poetry effectively sets the stage for more than 100 years of literary criticism and theory. By this introduction, we come to know that criticism starts with the Hellenistic period of Greeks, and Alexander the Great established the word into its highest epitome or the zenith. Therefore, our period of Alexander the Great, Augustine, Octavian, that was the best period of the literature in the Greek, and criticism as well. And with this, we come to know that Plato and Aristotle was majorly concerned the critics of the poetry. Plato was in favor of science. He himself was a poet, but he did not appreciate poetry, while Aristotle himself was a scientist, but he appreciated the poetry. So our first criticism started with the criticism of poetry. One was of the opinion, means Aeschylus was of the view that the poetry should be imaginative one, it should be rhetorics one. Rhetoric means in high speeches, highly ordered, well organized, and elevated language, while Euripides was of the view that poetry should be simple, it should be more encompassing to our political, social, and moral issues. So this is the short introduction of literary criticism in the age of Greeks, and this criticism has started from the Greeks as well. If you have any question, you can ask me in the comment section. I will be ready to answer your questions. Goodbye.